Welcome to The Creative Present, a show that's dedicated to expanding your creative self-expression and at the same time, getting your projects done. And I'm your host, Joshua Townsend.
And our last one about presence, which is, people call this the law of polarity, and which it is. It's about expansion and contraction. It's about the positive and negative. It's about the light and the dark. It's about the black and the white. It's always about the polarity. It's about the masculine and the feminine. It's about the sun and the moon. As long as you have polarity, you have something to work with, and you have to have polarity when you're dealing with narrative. In the expansion-contraction cycle, there's undulation, there's change, right? I'm expanding, I'm contracting. I'm having a positive experience, I'm having a negative experience. I'm being bright and shiny, I feel shut down, right? And that goes on continually throughout the narrative with short cycles and longer cycles. Then, depending upon your genre or what you're writing, it's either going to be an upward spiral or a downward spiral. They're either going to transform and be completely different than how they started at the beginning of the narrative, or it's going to be a downward spiral where they're going to be at a lower place, like a tragedy. A tragedy would fulfill that downward spiral, and a romantic comedy would fulfill the upward spiral, just as generalities. And then, of course, there is a slight, sometimes used perspective, which is you do a loop, which is, here we go again, meaning nothing's ever really changing and we're going to go through this cycle again, which is a little like purgatory, which could have the feeling of a downward spiral. And people can sometimes use this as a motif for comedies as well. So nothing ever really changes. We're all playing the same game, and life goes on. It's a little like sometimes in Shakespeare plays where everything always ends with a wedding. You know, no one really changes. Taming of the Shrew. No one really changes. She just pretends to change because we're going to get married and we're going to go through this again in a different way. So, expansion and contraction as being present in your presence is incredibly important, and it will keep your presence something that you want to keep engaged with. Like, I stay engaged and the audience also stays engaged. Very important, because ultimately where this goes in terms of narratives, specifically for actors and writers and producers and directors, is that we're watching behavior, and behavior is an extension of how the character thinks and feels in any given moment with an underlying state of being. And that state of being is going to be shifting from expansion to contraction, from positive to negative. And if you look at all scenes, and I mean all scenes, in all forms of narrative, there's going to be this constant dance between someone feeling like they're winning and then they're losing. Someone feels like they're getting one up on the other person, then they're not. Someone feels like they're getting their way, and then they're not. Courtroom dramas have to, and I mean have to, do this verbally. You have to feel like one side is winning, and then all of a sudden something changes, and then all of a sudden there's a big loss and the other side wins. It's just like watching any kind of sporting event. If you go to a sporting event and one team keeps getting touchdown after touchdown after touchdown in the first quarter, let's say it's American football and you're watching 4 quarters, and by the end of the first quarter it's 28-0, so they've had 4 touchdowns. And by halftime, it's double that, right? It's 54-0. Well, you're not going to stay for the rest of the game because you know how it ends, yeah? So this is the same thing. It's, if one side is just demolishing the other, it's not even fun to watch. It's actually, sometimes it can be kind of painful. And so we want to have a constant undulation between expansion and contraction, winning and losing. The other thing is kind of interesting too, which is when we get into really hard form narratives that almost feel like propaganda, when they're, this is no disrespect to like born again Christian films, but when there's a heavy agenda, I just know that. I just watched a few of those films, so I have a sense of that. When there's a heavy agenda, it's almost like Hallmark films as well. And you know how it's going to end, and there's no even real attempt to make it go another way. And you already know how it's going to end, and there's no real change, and the guy who has to change really isn't that bad, and the bad guy who's evil, who will die at the end or who will go to jail or whatever, is really evil, and there's no redemption for him. Everyone's playing caricatures, almost like a non-playing character, an NPC. Everyone's just sort of set in their little bandwidth. It can become very predictable to watch those, predictable in an unfun way. And sometimes, the Hallmarks and the other ways, they have a different element of endearment where you know how it's going to end, almost like novellas. You know how it's going to end, but there's something delightful in watching them play it out, almost like soap operas from the 60s and 70s. So it's not to say that they doesn't have a place. You just have to be very mindful of how you're doing that. So that's the sixth and final one of presence, which is, we went far afield on that one, which is when we really get into that presence and we really can go deep into both the expansion and the contraction on either polarity. And that will keep not only the character, but also the audience engaged in what's next and what's possible. I really appreciate you going through these 6 parts with me about exploring presence and how we can maintain that presence in the work in a very tangible way. So keep coming back for more tips and insights and approaches to the work here at The Creative Present.
Thank you for listening. If you love what you're listening to, please subscribe and then share with fellow creatives. For more, go to joshuatownsend.com.